that enjoys kicking all
Good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion House, New Mexico, working on oil painting protest. Alright, today I'm just going to continue, to start anyway, I'm going to continue fleshing out the lights and darks and broad strokes across the large portion of the landscape, and then narrow into some more detail with the central figures. So here we go.
That at one point defense of the status quo made sense. Now the straightest people in the world are beginning to quake in their boots. And the people who quote unquote run the world, they've got better information than you and I. And they leave their offices white-faced at night because they see, that capitalism is finished. Because capitalism depends on an endlessly exploitable resource base to function. They have no idea what you put in place of a market-driven capitalist economy. The population thing is under control. It is out of control. To get it under control, you would have to take on the people who've run Western civilization for 1,700 years, i.e. the Roman Catholic Church. Who wants to dig into that mess? The ozone depletion of the atmosphere may have already passed criticality. That may be a death sentence waiting to be served, and so forth and so on. So I don't think there is anybody. I think what we're seeing is spreading panic in the control centers of Western civilization, and that very soon you can have a real discussion. Essentially, the Clinton thing is just a gesture in that direction. But eventually, we're going to have a discussion about, who gets to go to the lifeboat and who doesn't, and stuff like that. It's all going to be very dicey, I think.
Could you have just talk a little bit about how society then would be informed by practicalities and what direction it might take, and how our present society could utilize this in a way that would be productive and not just the perpetuation of the false birth. Nancy Reagan is a philosophy just said no kind of thing.
Well, our problem is that we are in denial of our circumstance. If we could actually feel the situation, everybody would immediately walk to the parking lot, get in their car, and go out and slave to stop the agony. But we don't feel it. I mean, we see the pictures from Bosnia, we see the pictures from Somalia, we feel it to some degree, we send money, but we don't stop consuming furiously, we don't reconstruct our lives. Taking psychedelics, I think, because its primary function is to dissolve boundaries, it dissolves the boundary between you and the pain or the problem, and then you have to do something about it.
Who do you propose that this society is contribute to? I like to see that happen a little bit, but it's going to be psychiatrists, psychologists, church, or is it going to be are those accountants? I see that as a problem. I'd like to see what you're proposing.
Well, I think it should be self-organized. The way to do it is to make it legal. The spores are legal, they contain no psilocybin. There should be something called the Vegetable Drug Act, which simply states no plant is illegal. Really? That's it. And it would all sort itself out. And the junkie could have his little opium garden, and I don't know, if cokeheads could get it together enough to fill their backyard with coke, it would all sort out very, very nicely. And it's preposterous. I mean, you read that in the Middle Ages, that in 1432 in Amsterdam, a pig was hung for murder. And then that's the kind of thing we've got going with the concept of an illegal plant. I mean, from any future Enlightened point of view, they would just look back at that and say, how quaint, what a bizarre notion of reality. Yeah.
How the legalization of these substances is non-cultural context, and then you think about legalization, and then you think about making it really okay, and my mind gets like a lot of the time comes around, and that I don't know if I think it's possible to be without a battle or without a major shifting away from the work. It seems like something that can find itself.
Well, I think the hope comes from Europe. I think America would just be shamed into legalization because in Europe, the drug laws are very loose, and Europe is a truly secular society. I mean, they just don't have rattlesnake handling Christers and Branch Davidians and all. They cannot figure this stuff out. I mean, I had a German friend visit me in Hawaii last summer, and I took her to the beach, and she immediately whipped her top off. And then I had to explain that you couldn't do that in America. And she'd said she'd heard you couldn't do that in America, but she couldn't believe that it was actually true. And then when I, looking at her, thought what it would take to make it possible to take your top off at a public beach in America, you just realize this is a society of lost souls. I mean, this is a society of the screwballs that couldn't handle the secularization of Europe and came here to practice what they called religious freedom, which basically meant crypto-fascism on everybody else, Yeah, I agree. Look, black people didn't break loose till they got their backs up. Gay people would have been forever marginalized. They're not handing rights out in this society. You have to take it. And the drug thing has just been a polite conversation for far too long, I think. It's getting a little louder, but weasel arguments are being used. I mean, the reason cannabis is moving toward legalization is because an appeal is being made to the darkest impulses of capitalism. You could make so much money off this. What do you care that it's a drug?
What about the flip side of the argument on that responsibility? I sometimes wonder as much as we like to complain about law and structure, it seems like we also rely on that, provide certain structures around how companies we don't often claim the responsibility. How do you see, let's say, drugs and legalize, how would we self-manage in a responsible way to make that occur?
Well, I maintain that since alcohol and tobacco are legal, we have already proven that we can absorb the social consequences of legalizing any drug. I mean, if you can tolerate the costs and what alcohol and all that does to insurance, then heroin is going to pose no problem. The problem with the law is that when the law becomes irrational, the law loses its moral force. And so it has to be reformed. And this is, I believe, very difficult in this drug area because nobody's being straight about what's at issue. The real issue, like let's take cannabis, which is, most people, whether they smoke cannabis or not, have the impression, I think, that this is a generally benign and over-discussed peril. And yet, I cannot imagine America legalizing cannabis simply because its psychological consequences are that it erodes loyalty to the work ethic. If people are not interested in screwing widgets on vehicles, if they smoke, and contrast it to caffeine. Now, caffeine is a dangerous drug, does liver damage, known to be implicated in a number of pathologies. And yet, every labor contract signed in the Western world enshrines the right of laborers twice a day to stop the assembly line and tank up on coffee. This is an extraordinary folklore. And why? Because caffeine is a made-to-order drug for the purposes of slave capitalism. I mean, you just scurry right back to your keyboard or your assembly line, and you can do the 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. shift then without, falling on your face like a normal primate would, if they weren't jacked up on some alkaloid. And so that's very welcome. It was McLuhan who made the point, and it still hasn't been assimilated by enough people, that he said that technologies carry a hidden agenda and shape their user in ways that the user is never conscious of. And the great case that McLuhan made was print, which he said the linear and uniform nature of print created the preconditioned mindset able to accept democracy, the assembly line, the concept of the citizen. A whole bunch of modern ideas are presuppose print. Well, drugs are technology, and they shape the users in ways that the users never suspect. And our frenzied, goal-oriented, surface-obsessed society is a society of sugar, alcohol, red meat, and television. Television is an incredibly invasive and powerful drug. The average American watches 6 hours a day. Imagine if, following World War II, a drug had been introduced, that now the average American spends 6 hours a day absolutely loaded on this drug, doing nothing else. But because we are materialists, we don't see television as a drug, and yet, your blood pools in your rear end, your brain waves fall into a measurable zone, you fixate. There is an entire set of symptoms, no less dramatic than the symptoms of smoking a bomb or honking up a line. But we don't see television that way. And the horror of television is you don't even get to have your own trip. You have somebody else's trip, sponsored by the cosmetically enhanced purposes of products. I mean, talk about a hell drug, my God. Yeah.
The extreme minority of people who are using psychedelics right now unemployed, you see this little minute force being scattered around, really having an effect with constantly changing action before it's too late. To really work some change, or is it more like small colonies in the say?
Well, if it were business as usual, these psychedelic communities might not amount to anything. But I think that the world is going to get so peculiar as the chickens come home to roost that you'll have to take psychedelic drugs to understand what's going on. And that the people who don't will be running around like chickens with their heads cut off. Because we haven't come, people yak about the apocalypse, but this is not the apocalypse. This is the garden party before the apocalypse. I mean, once it really hits, it's going to require a great deal of faith to believe that we're going to make it through it. And I think that more and more organizations, governments, governing institutions are going to turn to the fringes for answers. Because what our circumstance is that history failed, orthodoxy failed, science failed, capitalism failed, reason failed. And we can't be practicing these things because they failed. The ship is sinking. We can't have a debate about when we'll arrive in Bermuda. We're never going to arrive in Bermuda. The boat is now sinking. So the agenda has to change. And also, these people are dying off. You know, the old control freaks, the people who have one foot in the 19th century. As to your question of whether or not it will happen fast enough, well, that's the horse race we're involved in. That's the excitement. You know? It'll be a photo finish. H.G. Wells said history is a race between education and catastrophe.
Yeah, I mean, Christianity for 300 years has become, you know, and it started off with different sects of people that were nurturing the Christian idea. Unfortunately, Roman Catholics had one, but it could be the same thing. We could start these little sort of copy classes of peyote cases like this.
Well, and Christianity was able to do that in a world where information moves at the speed of a horse's gallop. So, you know, there's an enormous psychedelic religion flourishing in Brazil right now that just cannot convert people fast enough. Is missionaryizing the United States. Shamanism. See, I think the reason I called my second book The Archaic Revival is because I think this is the overarching metaphor of the 20th century, that the 19th century was the gentleman's century, the white gentleman, when it all worked. Commerce flourished, cities were built, the poor knew their place, the brown people held their position. And the 20th century has been all about confronting the bankruptcy of all of that. And from the time of surrealism and Freud and Jung and Dada, right through to rave music and jazz and rock and roll and abstract expressionism, these are all archaic impulses. You know, the 19th century is all about realism, materialism, and defined social structures. The 20th century deconstructs the visual image, deconstructs the idea of simple location. We have body piercing, we have trance dancing, fire walking. All of these things are impulses to return to the primitive. And what it means is that in the aura of the realization that history has failed, we're going back to an earlier model. This is what societies do when they get in trouble. You know, we forget because we're the inheritors of it. But when medieval Christianity essentially got a flat tire by having 70 popes in 25 years, none of them died a natural death, that clued people to the idea that there was something wrong with Christian idealism. And the Renaissance capitalists, Italian city-state entrepreneurs, invented classicism. Classicism, meaning a society based on the ideals of Greece and Rome, was a science fiction option at that point. Greece and Rome had been buried in the ground for 1,500 years, and yet they dug it up. They dug up the buildings, they dug up the manuscripts, they dug it all up, and they said, this is how people should live, and we'll found classicism, and we will be the patrons of the arts, and we will undertake vast architectural undertakings, and so forth and so on. And it worked. It set a model for society, Roman law, Greek aesthetics, clear into the middle of the 19th century, when then the full consequences of an industrial reformation created, a kind of new serfdom of some sort. Now, we require such a radical a new paradigm that we have to reach outside the domain of history and time and the archaic there, which is a model of nomadism, of very little material culture, of hedonism, a lot of focus focus on sexuality, sensuality, body adornment, this sort of thing. And an information-based culture ruled by magic. In the case of the archaic, it was natural magic. In our case, it will be the technological magic of electromagnetic technology. You know, a global tide. McLuhan is right. I mean, McLuhan is given zilch credit. He understood all of this stuff. He said all of this by 1965. The people who dismissed him never understood him. I'm quite convinced. Yeah.
Or the methods were played to a role of trying to make that.
Well, I think that part of what we're on the brink of is a technological innovation, but I think also a rewiring of the human organism, and that what psilocybin is about is it's a catalyst for language production and evolution, and that the future evolution of language involves language being shifted into the visual domain. Notice how more visual reality is becoming, how icon-driven the computer interface is and stuff like this. I think that psychedelics hold the way toward a kind of telepathy. Not a telepathy of you hear my thoughts, but a telepathy of I see what you mean. This would erode boundaries tremendously. I mean, it's astonishing to think that our global civilization is linked together by nothing more than small mouth noises and the electronic transduction of same. I mean, small mouth noises are a very, very crude way to communicate the kind of complexity that our scene requires. The great thing about psychedelics is whether these personalities are realized or less than realized is that you don't need them. You know, the realized ones can be your friends, but the great thing about the psychedelic enterprise is that it's democratic and self-directed. And actually, my experience is that if you really take high doses, it's hard to be a rat. You have to have incredible defenses to be a real rat and take real high doses. And what it means is sooner or later it will ambush you in some tremendously unpleasant way, and then you will get straight. I think it's tremendously exciting because it's a chance to take control of the project of defining one's own authenticity. And I don't really, the idea of the guide, I'm glad that concept has given way to the idea of the sitter, because the sitter gets it much better. What the sitter is there to do is to keep you from rolling off the bed and to tell you that it's going to be all right, even though the sitter may have lost all confidence that it will ever be all right. And they are guiding you nowhere because they haven't the faintest idea where you are. You know, they're just there to reassure. Guided trips are as often ambiguous, I think, as positive. You know, I know a guy who takes mushrooms fairly often, and he always says to me, he says, each time I take it, my goal is to stand more. And what he means is that there's no bottom to it, and it will reveal literally as much as you can tolerate. And you know, you can get into a lock with it where you say, show me what you really are. Show me what you really are for yourself. And instantly, the cheerful scenarios of machine elves dancing mice and little candies spinning against black backgrounds, that's like suspended. And there's this organ tone, like from the Bach B minor Mass, and these black velvet curtains begin to lift. And after about 15 seconds of that, you say, that's enough, thank you, of what you really are for yourself, because you realize it is willing to comply with the request, but your mind can't handle it. It is coming at you through a series of veils. It is trying to be reassuring. I mean, you're saying, my God, it's an alien from the heart of the galaxy, and what it's trying to pass as is your next door neighbor. Because if it were ever to reveal the true dimensions of its alienness, you would probably vaporize in the presence of such peculiarity. Death by astonishment. We want to avoid that at all costs. Yeah. Stories abound. I mean, stories upon stories, amazing stories. And once you collect enough of them, you start collecting and thinking that there's going to be a pattern where you will learn something. Eventually you realize these stories are just designed to befuddle and lead you astray, and you cannot tell what is going on. Yeah, I've considered it great trip stories. Trading with the aliens. Some of you may know a wonderful little story by Clifford Feinuck. I was talking to somebody about this recently. It's about a man who goes to a garage sale and he buys an oak roll-top desk. And he gets it home and he discovers that he just notices actually that in one corner of this desk there's what looks like an ivory dot, an inlay of ivory. And he then has this desk, and after a couple of months, he finds this thing on this dot, which he doesn't know what it is. It's just some little thing that he can't figure it out. And he discovers, to make a long story short, that if he will put something on this dot, it will be traded. And so he puts a paper clip and he gets a something or other. And then he puts a dime and he gets something else every 24 hours, and he begins trading through this alien trader. They are meaningful, these creatures from hyperspace. And the trick is to get them to trade something that's very useful to you and valueless to them. I grew up in western Colorado, and up above 9,000 or 10,000 feet in the old mining camp, there are what are called pack rats. And what pack rats are about is they steal stuff. They steal little things, but they always leave something. They are trader rats. They don't actually steal. And there are many stories about people getting in league with the pack rat and trading 7-Up bottle caps for gold nuggets that were hidden in the walls, that because of these old mining towns, these rats have been stealing from the bar tills of a century ago. And so this is and the strange thing is, when you trade with a pack rat, you have to discern its psychology, because it may trade 7-Up bottle caps for gold nuggets, but if you switch to dimes, it will switch to dead bees, and they're no good to you. So you have to keep negotiating, you see, to get the good, and to, yeah. Yeah, that's
All right, I think I'm going to take a breather and do a second round here. So take two coming up. All right,
Sure.
take two.
The way it happened to me was someone in 1967, just a few months after I began taking LSD, somebody brought DMT to me and said, without any introduction, they just said, here's something you might be interested in. It's a drug. And I said, how long does it last? And they said, 5 minutes. I said, okay. Thinking, 5 minutes, what can it be, And what happens with DMT is you leap over all the barriers in the first few seconds. Unlike mushrooms, where over hours and hours on a high dose you might navigate yourself to the center of the mandala, DMT is like being struck by metaphysical lightning. I mean, the main question is, what the hell happened? Because it immediately took me to this place I had never suspected existed, this dome-like, brilliantly lit space where these self-transforming machine organic things were all around me and leaping through my body and singing and making objects and showing all this stuff to me. And it was like just all the veils were torn away in a single moment. And then that inspired me to look at the chemistry and then the botany and the shamanism, and to try and make my way back to that place at not quite such a super voltage. And that was the raison d'etre for going to the Amazon, because those drugs in the Amazon, those plant combinations are working off the same chemicals. It was the reason for being into the mushrooms, because the mushroom really, experientially and chemically, it's quite reasonable to call it a slow-release DMT trip. DMT is quite an astonishing thing. I don't understand how they manage to keep it secret, because it's the convincer, it's for the person who thinks these things only work if you're soft-headed, because it raises all the questions in a hurry. It's so intense and so oriented toward the other and the visual and the hallucinogenic that it isn't really like a drug. It's more like an event that you ran into. You just came around a corner and there was the unspeakable. I don't know if I would have ever, I was lucky in that sense. A lot of people take psychedelics a lot, I think, and never quite realize just what it is that they have their hands on, because you need these ego-threatening, if not life-threatening experiences somewhere along the way to hit you to just how intense this can be. There's nothing any more intense this side of the grave than a strong psychedelic experience.
Did you begin then to, once you've done the DMT, did you begin then to, as you would work with the psilocybin or the mushrooms, did you begin to, and since it's slower, you began to have some kind of recognition that you needed to invoke more and more, and you began to, did it take a ritual form, for example?
Well,
did you do the same thing each time?
What seemed most astonishing to me in these early DMT trips was that there was language that I hadn't expected, that what's going on in the DMT trip, besides the body transformations and the visual hallucinations and the little alien entities, is they are speaking to you and you are understanding, and yet they're speaking in a language which is visible, it's pure magic, it's pure linguistic intent, which you behold with your eyes, and you feel like Moses before the burning bush or something. You say, my God, I didn't know humans were wired for this kind of a thing. What is it? And then for many years I smoked DMT and contemplated it, and on DMT it comes very, very fast. It's like spun gold and mercury, and supremely intricate and supremely worked and rapid. And my dream was to be able to slow it down, to be able to do it, to be able to show it to people. And I read Robert Graves' The White Goddess and had the notion in there, he talks about a primary poetic language that he thinks existed before history, that was so from the bone and the flesh of people that anyone could understand it. It wasn't like Japanese and Iranian and American English. It was from the bones, not from the place. And poetry made in this language had the power not only to move people's hearts and to open their souls, but to actually cause them to see realities pass before their eyes, and that these poets were using sound and language to do something that we have only the faintest memory of. And what the DMT beings seemed to be saying was, this art can be brought back. this visible language, this poetry made manifest is what you should learn to do. And all the trips were about slow renewing, do this. And eventually I was able to do it on psilocybin. And then it was apparent to me that it's gibberish. And that I had somehow missed the mark, or that you have to be stoned, or that there are parts still to be learned. This is a very persistent theme in these deep psychedelic things, I think, is something is trying to be communicated that is not on the love one another level, but more like fold flap A to flap B, that kind of thing. There is concern to communicate the construction of something. And when I realized this and then looked back through mythology, it's always been there. The Mandayans, who were a Gnostic cult of even the pre-Christian period, had the notion that when the Messiah for them came, he would construct a machine of some sort. They call it this. That he would construct a machine, and that the machine would then pump all the souls to the moon, and then from there they would be taken care of in some way. But it was the missing link was a machine which the second Adam would come and build. Kat had this experience of the structure of the flying saucer when we were in the Amazon in '71. It was all about how do you build a trans-dimensional vehicle with the help of elfin advice. And it was molecular, it was interiorized, it had something to do with sound. You sing it into existence, but it has something to do with DNA. It's a technology that is fantasy for us, except that you can feel that this has always been the Pythagorean faith, that color, sound, angle of attack, all of these things could go together to produce a super technology and a vehicle. And in the deep psychedelic states, there always seems to be either the concern with building something, imparting information about a plan, or the other persistent motif that people have is that the world is going to end, and that there will be intervention of some spectacular sort, the second coming, flying saucers, something like that. Now, why these motifs exist, I don't know. I've talked at times about what I call the transcendental object at the end of time. And I think maybe what human history is a kind of collective psychedelic trip where we are closing in on the mystery at the center of the mandala, sort of the shamanic gift, difficult to obtain. And what it is, of course, is it's the human soul realized, and I almost said realized as a technology, but the realizing of it in any form would realize it as a technology. So that really history is the siren song of the soul, the saucer song of the soul, the group mind coming into existence through our efforts over several thousand years, something first glimpsed in dreams, and then glimpsed in, higher mythologies, and then glimpsed in technological visions and in psychedelic states, and finally actually invoked into history in such a way that its reality is incontrovertible. Then history ends. I don't understand why anyone could be moved to say such crazy things, but it seems to be the content of the experience. Now, of course, if any of you are psychologists, you recognize this as a syndrome, grandiose delusions, messiah complex, misplaced reference. It has different kinds of names. It means you think that you're going to be present or a part of the most important thing that ever happened. It's a serious form of mental illness, unless it's true. And you don't find out until it's too late. So, yes. Once the psychoactivity was discovered, the real visionary potential of the mushroom, I think it would be connected to the cow. It would be viewed as a product of the cow in the same way that the manure, the hide, the milk, the blood, and the flesh was. And it's significant that in the Middle East, at the very earliest stratum of culture that is anything other than the chipping of flint, there are images of cattle. Cattle everywhere. Cattle at Altamira, cattle at Lascaux, painted very, very sensitively. What the ancient cave art of North Africa and Southern Europe is a celebration of women and cattle. Men appear as stick figures wielding spears. Women are drawn as filled-in curvilinear structures. Their fecundity, their pregnancy, in many cases their physical beauty. I don't know how many of you know the paintings of the Tasselli frescoes in Algeria, but there are paintings of seated women that are as good as anything Monet or Gauguin did. I mean, where it's feeling, it's the curve of the hip and the incurve of the back and the swell of the belly under the breast. And this is, it's figurative drawing as good as we do today. So women and cattle at the very earliest stratum of consciousness are mixed together. We always talk about this early level of culture as hunting, gathering, and I think that we drop our voices. We say it's a hunting, gathering culture. If you've spent time in the Amazon, you know that what this means is once a month or once every 6 weeks, the men get their acts sufficiently together and they make up enough coca that they all go get their bows and arrows and they go off for a hunt and leave the women and the children behind and get all coked up and hunt and party all night. And then when the coca is all gone, because usually women make the coca, when the coca is all gone, whatever they've captured on the hunt, they triumphantly carry back to the village. And often, it's garbage. And the women will be waiting at the village for them to come back and say, 8 days in the woods and you bring back one maggoty agouti? What kind of clowns are you people? But this is the hunt, and the hunter is the hero, and they'll tell the story around the campfire. Meanwhile, what is really going on, as is always the case, is that women are gathering. And gathering is a highly conscious activity where, this plant is okay, that plant is bad, the root of this plant is poisonous, but if pounded with water and washed, becomes edible. It's an activity that demands discrimination, intelligence, a body of lore, memory, powers of observation, so forth and so on. It is in fact serious business. While this hunting thing exists almost to keep the men out of the women's hair. So you can imagine that the visual acuity thing had as great an impact on the gathering as it did on the hunting. Because in many plants, it's very hard to tell the poison from the non-poison. And also, there are forms of visual acuity that are so removed from our awareness that we don't even recall them, such as being able to track an animal, or being able to tell where animals have been, or being able to tell just by the color of a landscape where the water is flowing under the ground, and therefore where certain kinds of plants will occur. All of these cognitive activities, these integrative activities that rely on observation and memory, were tremendously aided by the presence of an imagination-enhancing enzyme in the food chain. And the goddess religions of the ancient Middle East are nothing more than the tail end of this. It went on for 15,000 years, and then it began to fade out about 5,000 years ago. The imagination, the Living in the Imagination conference we just had, we were very, very fortunate to have Rian Eisler come in and talk to us. If you're not aware of her work, I urge you to look into it. Rian Eisler wrote The Chalice and the Blade, and she is a brilliant woman, archaeologist, a refugee from Nazi Europe, and her notion is, that not that there was a patriarchy in prehistory and then we fell in, a matriarchy and then we fell into patriarchy, and that this has been the problem. She has managed to de-genderize the cultural debate by inventing the terms partnership culture and dominator culture. We live in a dominator culture, and so do the English, in spite of Margaret Thatcher. It's not about women, and it's not about men. It's about feminine and masculine attitudes. And Rian, using the work of Maria Gimbutas and other people, has made a brilliant case that the natural equilibrium state of human society is to be in a partnership culture where the only hierarchies are hierarchies of function. People do what they can do well, but an administrator is not a more advanced member of society than a gardener. Nothing is seen to be intrinsically somehow higher or lower. They're just functions performed by people. Well, the great hope that she holds out is that if we recognize that what happened was simply a mistake, the allowing of the
Alright, I think that's it for this session. It's pretty thoroughly saturated across the entire surface. It's hard to find a place to put a pinky down to do any more detail. But I think it's pretty close. The figures, central figures need more detail. And then I'll probably just ratchet up the detail around the whole surface with a little more light and dark kind of thing. But it's getting closer.
We're not doomed at all. Now, what I've hoped to do and want to do is accept Rian's premise that there was a partnership culture that around 1500 BC died out completely, its last stand being Minoan Crete, and that it was then replaced by a dominator culture. I accept all that.
All right.
What I want to know is why? How could such a thing have happened?
So that's it for the time being. Thank you for watching. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion Tiles, New Mexico, working on oil painting protest. Have a good night, Earth.